This November, California voters will be asked to sort through 17 ballot measures and a voter's guide that has the look of a Russian novel. In part 2 of our two-part series on the November ballot measures, we'll hear from the experts at the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office who have analyzed the spending measures as well as the political reforms on this year's ballot. Helen Kerstein, Ryan Miller, Carolyn Chu, Ben Johnson, Amber Didier, Dan Kaplan, and Ryan Anderson. The 2016 propositions, tax and spending issues, and a little political reform.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. The state's Legislative Analyst Office provides a nonpartisan analysis of propositions on the November ballot. Our first guests are LAO authors of reports dealing with taxes and revenues. They are Helen Kerstein and Ryan Miller. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Ryan, I'm going to start with you first. Prop 55, which would extend most of the provisions of Prop 30, which was Governor Brown's temporary tax. I mean, that gets people sometimes. But anyway, they're talking about extending it now. That Prop 30 was approved by the voters in 2012. So let's start with a little background. What was Prop 30 all about?
Proposition 30 increased personal income taxes on high-income taxpayers, and also increased the sales taxes you mentioned that everybody pays. Raised about $7 billion of revenue a year, and the money was used to increase funding for schools and community colleges and to help the state balance the budget, during the downturn.
I think people may not recall, but we used to have Mac Taylor on the show a number of years ago, and we were talking about $20 billion deficits as far as the eye could see. And then when they passed Prop 30, all of a sudden we had this like $6 billion surplus, and oopsie, it just so happens that Prop 30 brought in about that amount of money. So that's one of the reasons that the budget was actually balanced. So it's going to end. The sales tax ends at the end of 2016, and then the tax on higher income earners is going to end, I think, in 2018, I believe.
Yeah, that's what Prop 30 would
and
do.
so now this would extend it to,
that's right.
to 2030?
Yeah, through 2030. So it extends the personal income tax increases on high-income taxpayers. We think that the measure would raise about $4 to $9 billion of revenue a year, depending on.
That's a big swing.
Yeah,
$4 to $9 billion.
Well, as you mentioned, the kind of swings in the economy and so forth. The stock market and the economy would have a lot to do with how much revenue.
Can you explain that a little bit for our audience? Why is it that this $5 billion swing in your projections? You guys are pretty smart people, right? So the swing is so big because what? We rely so much on the stock market.
Yeah, the states. Yeah, and these taxes would be focused on high-income taxpayers. Their incomes tend to sway quite a bit with changes in the economy and in particular with the stock market.
They're not wage earners. They make their money from capital investments.
Yeah, by and large.
Right, and so that's when the market goes up and down, the state really gets hit when they are taxed this way.
That's right.
So the financial implications of Prop 55, go over those again. They're pretty significant.
Yeah, so as I said, between $4 and $9 billion a year, depending on those factors. About half of the revenue would be used for schools and community colleges.
And the reason for that is?
Well, the state has a constitutional minimum funding guarantee. It requires
Prop 98.
Yeah, Prop 98 to get technical. It requires a minimum amount to be spent on schools and community college. Because that's partly dependent on revenue, this increased revenue would increase the amount that state has to spend on
a lot of money, and I think they were saying that K through 14, because it's not just K through 12, community colleges are included in that Prop 98 measure, that about $50 billion are going to education on an annual basis. So a lot of money.
Of state money. And then in addition, there's local property tax money as well.
Right, so lots of money for that, and we'll see if that continues. Okay, Helen, let me ask you about Prop 53. Very interesting. It deals with revenue bonds used to fund big infrastructure projects. Currently, how are those big infrastructure projects paid for? How do they do it now?
So it depends. The state sometimes funds these projects on a pay-as-you-go basis, basically using current year revenues. Other times the state borrows, especially for those big projects. And there are a couple of different ways the state typically borrows. One is general obligation bonds, and general obligation bonds are typically repaid from the state's general fund. Another way is revenue bonds, as you mentioned, and revenue bonds are different in that they're typically repaid from the revenues generated from the project.
So that usually it's the users, right? It's like some kind of fee that the users have to pay.
Exactly. So an example that I think a lot of folks might understand is a bridge. So if we're going to construct a bridge, we could issue revenue bonds to pay for that bridge, and then the toll users...
The toll users would pay for it. Now, if you use it, not to get too technical, but if you use general obligation bonds, you go to the legislature and say, hey, legislature, pay $1 billion for that bridge.
Right.
Okay.
And then general taxpayers, including those who,
People who live in Fresno will be
Right.
paying for a San Francisco bridge.
Right.
Okay,
Exactly.
there you go. So that kind of explains it too. So what exactly would Prop 53 do?
So one of the things to note is that under existing law, state general obligation bonds require state voter approval, but state revenue bonds don't. So this would change the voting requirement for certain state revenue bonds. So state revenue bonds that are over $2 billion for projects that are owned, operated, and managed by the state would have to receive voter approval. So really these big revenue bonds for big projects.
So the idea is that with a general obligation bond, the voters should pass this because this comes out of the voters' the general fund of the legislature or the state, as opposed to revenue bonds that are paid by fee users. So why should the public weigh in on a revenue bond? But this author of this proposition saying, yeah, when you have these really big projects, voters should weigh in even though they're not necessarily a user or paying a fee.
I think that's correct, yeah.
Okay, but two big projects would be affected here. The water fix, the Twin Tunnels project, right, and high-speed rail, correct?
Well, those are certainly large enough that they could fall under
potentially,
this
okay.
measure. It's uncertain whether they would or not because it's uncertain, for example, whether the high-speed rail project will actually use revenue bonds, but certainly they're large enough that they could qualify.
And the person behind this project, behind this proposition, I believe is someone from the Stockton area who's concerned about the Twin Tunnels project. I think that's one of the drivers here. But it's going to be interesting. People should follow the money. Anyway, thank you for explaining those two revenue measures on this November's ballot. Up next, we're going to talk about some of the health-related measures on the November ballot. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with experts from the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office about propositions on the November ballot. We're now joined by Carolyn Chu. Welcome.
Thank you.
Ben Johnson and Amber DG, correct? Okay, so we're going to talk about some health-related measures, and we're going to focus first on Prop 56. So Carolyn, we're going to talk to you about that. That's the tobacco tax. It also includes e-cigarettes, by the way. It's the latest attempt to increase the state's cigarette tax. Voters rejected a similar measure back in 2006. So where are we currently when it comes to tobacco tax in California?
Currently, the tobacco tax in California, there are different rates for cigarettes compared to other tobacco products. Right now, the tax on a pack of cigarettes is 87 cents per pack. And on other tobacco products like cigars and chewing tobacco, it's the equivalent of $1.37 per pack.
Okay, quite a bit more. So how would Prop 56 change all that?
So Proposition 56 would increase the taxes on tobacco products by $2. So the tax on cigarettes would increase to $2.87
That's a big
per
jump.
pack. And the tax on other tobacco products would go up to $3.37, or the equivalent of $3.37 per pack. The measure also would include electronic cigarettes in the definition of other tobacco products for the first time. So electronic cigarettes would become subject to tobacco taxes.
They're getting taxed, and it seems like people like taxes as long as they're not being taxed. And smoking rates, use of tobacco products have gone down generally, like since '88 in the last 30, 40 years, but now you're saying what, it's more plateauing?
They have been relatively stable over the past few years.
So I think the
yes.
number I saw from your report was in 1988 it was 24% of Californians were users, and now it's 12%, but it's kind of, so it went down pretty significantly, but now it's kind of plateaued.
Correct, it is plateaued.
So that gets us to the money. So if we put this tax, a pretty big increase, how much is that going to increase money for the state and local governments?
So the measure is very specific, and on net we estimate that the measure would raise over $1 billion from these new taxes. The measure outlines how those revenues should be spent. So the majority of the revenues from these new taxes would have to be spent to augment the state spending on low-income health care for low-income Californians.
So it's going specifically to certain items?
Correct, yes. The measure deposits the monies into a special fund, and the measure describes how those monies should be spent.
Just to kind of, you see a lot of numbers, $1 billion here, $1 million there. For a lot of people, you kind of glaze over, but just to put everything in context, the state budget, general fund budget is about $122 billion. About $23 billion is for Medi-Cal, which is for the low-income people, medical service. So this is going to bring in about $1 billion
Correct.
on a program that's about $23 billion. So it kind of gives you an ish. If you're a voter, okay, it has some impact. $1 billion is a lot of money, but percentage-wise, maybe not as great as you think.
Right, it would still be a relatively small percentage of overall spending.
Okay, Ben, let's talk to you about prescription drug prices. Prop 61 would limit the price that state agencies pay for prescription drugs to the lowest price paid by the U.S. Veterans Administration. I guess the VA is getting some good deals on drug prices. So how is the price set currently when the state agencies buy prescription drugs? How's that amount of money, that price set?
Well, there actually is no statewide price for prescription drugs in the state of California, and no uniform way that state programs actually set their prices. Different agencies, say the Medi-Cal program or Department of Corrections, they pay different prices, and their pricing arrangements are established according to individual program needs of that program. So Medi-Cal, as the state's Medicaid program, they largely pay for drugs under federal arrangements that limit the prices they pay, whereas the Department of Corrections negotiates prices with wholesalers or manufacturers in league with some other state departments in order to try to obtain lower prices on the drugs that they ultimately make available.
So it
to
sounds like,
inmates.
so we have California state agencies buying drug X, but there's no uniformity as to what they're paying for drug X.
Exactly.
Wow. And so they could be paying a lot or not so much. It's interesting how to get that all into shape. So Prop 61 tries to address that a little bit. It's trying to change the way the state pays for prescription drugs. In what way? How would it change the process? No uniformity to what?
So what Prop 61 would do is it would set a cap for what state entities may pay for a particular prescription drug. And what it does is it limits the prices that any state entity may pay to the lowest prices paid by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. The one exception to this would be the Medi-Cal Managed Care Plan, which serves approximately 75% of Medi-Cal beneficiaries across the state.
A large number. What's the fiscal impact of this?
Well, that's difficult to say. The amount of money that this measure will save the state.
Initially it sounds intuitively like it save a lot of money.
That's right. The United States Department of Veterans Affairs obtains some of the lowest prescription drug prices in the country, according to our understanding. But the amount of savings that this measure would actually produce is just highly uncertain, given two factors. Okay. Sometimes the prices that the VA pays are not actually publicly available, and we are not sure if the state is going to actually be able to obtain that pricing information.
So you're going to say we're going to cite the VA
measure.
Prices, but we don't know necessarily what those VA prices are.
Not necessarily the lowest prices.
Right.
We do have access to some VA pricing information, but they may not be the lowest pricing. Okay. And to be able to implement this measure and obtain the greatest savings, we'd want those lowest prices.
And do the drug manufacturers have to sell you those drugs at those prices?
They do not. So what this measure does is it prohibits the state from paying more. Drug manufacturers are free to either not sell, or another alternative strategy would be for them to raise VA prices, which they are free to do, and this could mitigate any savings.
Right.
The measure.
Right. So they say, okay, fine. If California's going to follow VA prices, we'll just up the price for the VA, and there we go again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And this would reduce, but not necessarily eliminate savings.
No, that's a big issue. Prescription prices are a big issue these days. It's going to become a bigger issue as the population ages. So this is going to be obviously a pretty important issue on the November ballot. Well, Amber, let me ask you this: we've got Prop 52 on these quality assurance fees paid by hospitals. What is this hospital fee, and how does it impact our healthcare system?
The hospital fee is a charge assessed by the state on private hospitals, and the revenue it generates is used in two ways. In part, it offsets general fund spending in the Medi-Cal program, which is our health coverage program for the low-income population. And in part, it's used to pay hospitals increased Medi-Cal payments. This brings in federal funds, which results in a net benefit to the hospital industry.
Okay, so what do they want to do with Prop 52?
Prop 52 would extend the current hospital fee, which is set to expire on January 1st, 2018, permanently, and it would make it somewhat harder for the legislature to change the fee.
So it sounds like they want to lock it in.
That's right.
Essentially. Okay, well, thank you very much for that overview of healthcare measures. Up next, we're going to talk about the education measures on the November ballot. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Education issues are again on the ballot. We have two education policy experts from the nonpartisan LAO joining us, Dan Kaplan and Ryan Anderson. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So we're going to discuss two education measures, Prop 51, which would authorize $9 billion for school construction bond, and Prop 58, which would restore some bilingual education programs. So Dan, let me start with you with Prop 51, and that's this $9 billion school bond measure. How are K-12 and community colleges facility projects currently funded?
For the last 2 decades, California has had a cost-sharing arrangement between the state and local districts, such that both contribute toward funding towards the construction of new facilities. On the K-12 side, districts will submit project proposals to the State Allocation Board, which then vets these proposals and determines which projects to fund.
Okay.
On the community college side, it's the Chancellor's Office of the community college system that determines which projects to select for funding and then submits these to the legislature and governor as part of the annual budget process, and those two entities vote on whether or not to approve
so the
them.
chancellor and the community college district has a lot of power there because they're deciding where the facilities are going to be built, as I would think.
They do have power in terms of selecting projects, projects to bring forth to the legislature, but it is ultimately the legislature and the governor to
True, I don't want to take any
award
power
funding.
away from the legislature to the governor. So Prop 51, how would it fund education facilities?
Prop 51 would authorize the state to issue $9 billion in new general obligation bonds. Now, $2 billion of these dollars would go to funding community college facilities, while the remaining $7 billion would go to K-12 districts.
And we're talking about things like new construction, modernization, career technical education, those kinds of things.
Exactly. $3 billion for new construction, $3 billion for renovation projects, and the remaining $1 billion split between career tech and charter schools.
I love that when we talk about the state budget, $1 billion, $1 billion here, $500 million there, whatever. But that's the budget, right? The budget's $122 billion, so it's, $1 billion is not a lot in that context. So what is the fiscal impact of this measure?
The state repays its general obligation bonds through annual debt service payments. Our office estimates...
Just like you pay your house, your mortgage, and okay.
Exactly. Over the next 35 years, our office estimates the state's annual debt service payments will increase by $500 million per year if Prop 51 were to pass. Over the life of these payments, we estimate that the total cost of the state would be about $17.6 billion. Now, this accounts for both the principal and interest payments.
And it's about, the way I look at your numbers, I read your report, is $9 billion in principal and about $8.6 billion in interest. So about half interest and half principal. That's the cost of money, right? Well, Ryan, let me ask you about the implications of this Prop 58, the bilingual education measure. First, what's the current situation when it comes to bilingual education in California?
Well, currently there are very few bilingual programs in California, which is to say that of students who are acquiring English as a second language, most are currently taught in an English-only environment. By contrast, a bilingual program would teach these students at least part of the day in their native language.
I think that would surprise a lot of people, that this really has changed, and that change came about as a result of Prop 227, which was a few years. I can't remember the year that was passed.
1998.
98.
Yes.
Where it really went down. It used to be that quite a few people were in bilingual education, and now the
So at the
much
time
less.
that Proposition 227 was passed, about 30% of what we call English learners were in a bilingual program. In the most recent data, that's a little less than 5%.
Wow, that's a huge drop. And this would change things.
Yes.
So what would Prop 58 do to make bilingual education more prevalent in California schools?
So Prop 58 would make it significantly easier for schools to start a bilingual program if that's what they were interested in. Under current law, under 227, schools to enroll a student in a bilingual program have to prove for each individual student that they cannot be served properly in an English-only environment and then receive explicit parental permission. Prop 58 would eliminate those requirements.
It makes it much easier just to have bilingual education. So what's the cost of essentially restoring some of these bilingual programs back into the schools?
So we don't think there's a significant cost difference in running a bilingual as opposed to an English-only program. Of course, to start a bilingual program, schools would have to hire qualified teachers, get appropriate materials, but we find on average that bilingual teachers are not paid significantly more than their English-only counterparts, and textbooks written in Spanish don't tend to cost significantly more than those.
I think that would surprise a lot of taxpayers that you found not really a big difference in offering bilingual educations. Interesting point. Well, I want to thank Dan Kaplan and Ryan Anderson for that discussion on education reform. Up next, we're going to talk about some other reforms about the political process on the November ballot. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. There are two items on the November ballot that attempt to reform the political process. We're joined by two experts from the nonpartisan LAO, Ann Hollingshead, and welcome, Ann.
Thanks.
And Nick Schroeder. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks.
So we're going to take a closer look at some of those proposals, and we're going to start with you and Prop 54, which aims to provide more transparency by prohibiting votes on bills that are not in print for at least 3 days. Sounds kind of logical. Read it before you vote on it. How does the process currently work?
Sure. So the way the legislative process currently works is members of the legislature will meet in official meetings, usually committee hearings and other similar settings, and they will discuss and make changes to bills. These meetings are generally open to the public. Most, but not all, are streamed online and available for people to see. And then at the end of the process, legislators typically have a few days to consider changes to bills before they would take a vote on that bill.
Is this thing we call sometimes here as a gut and amend? Sometimes does that happen? They kind of like change the bill at the last minute and people are voting on things they really don't know what they're voting on?
Right, so sometimes it does happen that there are fewer than a few days that legislators and members of the public have to see changes to a bill before a vote is taken on that bill.
Is this expensive to do this? I mean, if we were going to give this 3-day notice and we're going to televise all these things, is that a big expense?
We don't estimate any costs associated with the 72-hour rule. We do estimate costs associated with the other portion of Prop 54, which would require videos to be taken of all legislative public meetings.
When you think about the size of state government, you know, the $122 billion general fund, and I think I was reading your report, you're talking about a one-time cost of $1 to $2 million to get this thing set up, and then an ongoing cost of $1 million a year. Right. It sounds like a lot, but to educate the public, you know, 39 million, whatever we have, Californians, it seems like it might be a good investment to, you know, to spend that. And by the way, a lot of it is televised by the California channel. If folks want to see that online. Very interesting. So Nick, I want to ask you about Prop 59, which is an advisory measure, kind of interesting. And it essentially asks the state to work to overturn the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision on campaign financing. So if you're going to talk about campaign financing today, how is it funded currently?
Well, so there's two broad groups of types of spending. There's contributions and independent expenditures. So a contribution would be where you give money directly to a candidate, and then the candidate decides how to use that money to communicate an opinion with the voters. Independent expenditure would be where you spend the money directly to communicate with the voters, either by production of an ad or some other thing, without the involvement of the campaign. And in 2010, you mentioned the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United. The court determined that independent expenditures is a form of speech that's protected under the U.S. Constitution. Isn't that independent expenditures, as opposed to what you're saying, direct contributions? The independent expenditures are getting bigger and bigger, becoming more and more an important part of the political process. Certainly, especially after making it so there is no limit, because it's now seen as... Right, I mean, it's seen as a protected form of speech, so we can't impose limits. But there are limits on direct contributions? Yes. But there are no limits on these independent expenditures? Correct. Wow, and so it's free for all. So if someone wanted to go about and change that ruling, how do you overturn Citizens United through the Constitution? Well, you can amend the Constitution, or sounds like an onerous process. Sure. I mean, it's a you know, there's a couple ways to do it. You can either do it by convention or by vote by Congress and go. Okay, I don't think we're going to see a constitutional convention. No. So we'd have a vote by Congress. Right. Vote by Congress, then have to go to the state legislatures, and what is it? 38 states or something have to approve it. I believe that's correct. Yeah. Right. Wow. It's a long, drawn-out process. Right. I mean, and the alternative would be that a future Supreme Court could offer a ruling that would change the interpretation of the Constitution. Right, so what's the point of Prop 59? So it is, as you say, an advisory measure. And so what that means is that it doesn't require any elected officials, it doesn't require legislature or the U.S. Congress to take any particular action. But what it does do is it provides the voters an opportunity to opine as to whether or not we should overturn Citizens United. And express their frustration, maybe. Sure, correct. Okay, and so what is it going to cost the state? Was it going to cost the state a lot of money to do that? We basically, there's no direct fiscal effect from this. Okay, so there's no real fiscal effect, but it's probably going to have a big effect on political campaigns if they address, if that ever does get overturned. I mean, sure, if it's ever overturned, it'll have a significant effect on campaign financing, but this is just one step in that process. Okay, so if you're frustrated with the process, here's your chance to kind of speak your piece. Sure. So remember to vote. Well, I want to thank Ann Hollingshead and Nick Schroeder, as well as other folks in the Legislative Analyst's office, for joining us here today. So get out there, get the information, and vote. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.